So this tutorial is going to look at the different causes of unemployment. Firstly, we'll look at this thing called equilibrium unemployment, and then we'll have a closer look at what's called demand deficient unemployment, which relates to what happens when firms have less demand for labour in the economy. So the first thing up is just to explain what we call the labour market. So the labour market is a place where labour is traded, and the two variables that we have is usually on the bottom axis is the quantity of labour, measured in like hours per week or the number of workers that work. On the other side, we have the wage that those workers get paid for this quantity of labour. Tricky thing to remember is that this demand for labour here actually comes from firms, comes from people, the companies and our producers that require the labour for it, and this wage over here is called is a factor reward for the labour itself. And so what we'd simply do is we draw onto the curve is called the aggregate supply of labour. And the supply comes from people like me and you who work in economies, and depending on what the wage rate is, we have different willingnesses to work. So at a low wage rate, down the bottom, is relatively few number of people or workers that would work. They trade off what's called leisure time for work. But as that wage steadily increases, we get more and more people who are willing to participate in the labour market. Sometimes you see this kind of idea of where the aggregate supply for labour has a kind of vertical line at the end, which is perhaps the idea that there's a maximum quantity of people that could work in the economy. Even in other times, you might see how the curve goes slightly backwards at really high wages. If people earn extremely high wages, they might decide to begin to sacrifice some work for leisure time. So the quantity of labour goes down at really high wages. That's just kind of a simple concept. And so what happens is, you often see diagrams that look like this, which have a separate curve which starts here. Draw this very carefully. Going up this way. And we call this curve the total labour force. And remember, there's some people that don't actually work at different wages for a variety of reasons. They choose not to enter the labour market. Maybe they're looking after children for different variety of reasons. So change pens, at equilibrium, if we call this wage 1, we have a quantity of labour. This is kind of at my equilibrium concept, a quantity of people that are willing to work at a given wage rate. There's also a series of people over this side, which we can call maybe, say, Q for labour 2, or sometimes you see it labelled as QF. This is the people that could potentially work, they're fit and able to work, maybe they're skilled enough, but there's not enough of an incentive for them at this wage rate to work. So I like to see on the bottom axis kind of a really clever way to label them is to label, well, if this is a zero number of people, and say this is the quantity of labour, these are my people here that have employment. They're my people that are really happy and have their jobs. These people here, kind of my gap between say Q1 and Q2, these are my people that are voluntarily unemployed. And if you see from the rest of the book, there's kind of an explanation of these different gaps and who we exactly define as being voluntarily unemployed. This idea of this equilibrium and this here is also defined as what's called equilibrium unemployment. So there's always a series of people. You talk about in economies how the unemployment rate is 6%. It's at an all-time low, but it's still at 6%. That tends to be the sort of portion of people here who are not willing to work at the given wage rate. Even if there's more jobs and even if they were paid more, generally they don't kind of participate in the labour market. I mean, you have to be careful as well. The labour force also doesn't include people that are studying or that are outside of this kind of 18 to 65 age bracket, or people that are disabled are not technically included in the definition for the labour force. The second type of unemployment, so this is what we call equilibrium unemployment, the second type is called demand deficient. So our diagram looks fairly similar. We can draw it like this, with our aggregate supply for labour over this side. I'm going to draw it very similar to what we did before, with total labour force going up like that, and label the equilibrium really carefully. This is my wage rate 1, Q1, down the bottom here. And this is interesting. So what happens if, remember these aggregate demand here, this comes from firms who are producing things, and they pretend if we're in a recession, for instance, there's less demand for final goods and services. This is called this is our market for labour. And labour itself is derived from the demand for final goods. If there's less demand for, say, bicycles and cars and televisions, there will be less demand for labour in the economy. And you get this kind of idea. So I'm just going to change colours, it's getting a bit confusing. So a shift backwards of this aggregate demand curve looks a bit like this. So AD for labour 2, label this as my first equilibrium there. So we're going to shift backwards this way. And what happens immediately is, there's no real change in the wage that occurs in the economy. Over time, the market might react and fall back to a new equilibrium. Remember, wages are generally called a downward sticky. They are less likely to drop instantaneously. So what happens is you get a couple of different examples. You get, at this wage rate, you get 3 scenarios. We have 1 between this point and this point, 2, a quantity of people from this point to this point, and then this third quantity over the side. So really simply, this first group of people is the employed. If we can label it down the bottom here as well. This part of people down the bottom here, they're our employed people. Secondly, we have this group of people here who would like to work. We're happy to work in the economy, but we call them involuntarily unemployed. And we also, and this is often described as being like also these are the people that are unemployed because of the demand deficiency in the economy. Thirdly, we still have these people that are voluntarily unemployed and decided they don't want to work at the current wage rate. So we've got these three different types of unemployment that occur in the market. Over time, though, what will happen is that some of their workers will start accepting lower wages that were previously unemployed. And if they accept lower wages, we kind of track down this curve back towards a new equilibrium point there. Firms will start paying workers less this way, and we kind of get, we fall back to this kind of new equilibrium in the middle there. Pretty much, these are our 2 different types of unemployment. There's also cyclical unemployment, which is sort of related to this idea here of being demand deficient. There's another kind of language being used. We have frictional unemployment, that's people that are temporarily between jobs. Then also seasonal unemployment. Both seasonal and frictional are kind of quite hard to describe using diagrams, but nevertheless, this should summarize the main points.